We always want to be thinking about measuring our capacity from a protective perspective. But the other thing is that you want to be thinking about the capacity in terms of knowing when to hire, making sure that you understand work allocation, right? Who gets how many cases and when, based on what stage of case they're at. And a lot of that is about timing out the legal work, which is something that most lawyers that go into business for themselves at least have some general interest in, right? Because a lot of us, we start off as lawyers and then we become business people, not vice versa. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Crushing Chaos with Law Firm Mentor podcast, where on today's episode, we are going to talk about financial projections in your cash machine. All right. So this is a topic that came up very recently at one of our retreats. We actually brought this topic ancillarily, we'll say, to the bear when we were talking about the finances, if you will, of sales, right? And I think a lot of times we get really excited as law firm owners when we talk about sales, right? That's how we make money in our law firms, is we grow through selling and serving more clients. The difficulty with that is, of course, that a lot of times what happens is dollars in don't oftentimes find their way to an assignment in the future. Oftentimes, dollars in means just dollars in the bank, right? So whether you are using trust accounting or not every jurisdiction in the United States requires trust accounting. I think that is something that some legal consultants are not aware of, but it's very true. So whether you're using trust accounting or not, you ultimately have to keep track of where your money is going regardless, right? And oftentimes we think about keeping track of where our money is going from the perspective of looking at where it is going over the immediate next few days, next few weeks, sometimes even next few months. But a cash flow projection gives us a snapshot of where we will need money and how much into the future. And the better you get at creating a really sound financial projection, the better your firm will run. Not just from the perspective of extra cash in means more opportunity for you and your teams to make more money, but also knowing when you actually have more money. Because if you happen to have money today, that doesn't mean that you are more profitable over the course of your law firm. It might mean on today's snapshot, you are more profitable. It might mean on today's revenues, you are exceeding where you expected to be, etc. But if you don't sustain that growth, if you don't plan for expenses that you know are coming down the pike, what'll often happen is you spend today's money, and then when you need money tomorrow, you don't have any more, right? So the infamous cash crunch comes up. So we want to help you to actually avoid that very stress-inducing problem that's very common in law firms and very common in particular in solo and small law firms by thinking about and actually giving you some qualitative factors to consider when you are building out your cash flow projections. Okay. All right. So let's dive in. First thing we want to talk about is anchoring your projections to historical data, right? So it's important to understand what you know has already been your spending past when you are considering your spending future. This means you want to have a general sense of when and where you make money historically and when you expect to make money in the future. Case in point, perfect example. We have a client here at Law Firm Mentor who has always had a surge in the first quarter of the year. That is how his business runs. That is always something that he is very comfortable in. And so he is always given out large bonuses at the end of the year. One, to reduce the tax bill for next year, but two, in contemplation of and in very reasonable historical confidence in having made that first quarter big jump, right? Well, he started to add practice areas. And one of the things he was really excited about was that one practice area kind of took off. And the lawyer that he had hired that was going to staff that additional practice area told him, generally speaking, the summers are slow. It gets busier when kids go back to school in September, and then you have a lull at Christmas, and it probably picks up again around March. Okay. So this lawyer had the gist of what was going on. Problem is that lawyer's gist was based on being an associate in someone else's law firm and what he thought was how work flowed through to him. The problem is that does not mean that work flowing through to him that was partially generated by the business and partially generated by himself was replicable, right? Because he was going on his gut and his feeling. Well, as it turns out, our client also subsequently purchased the law firm where this associate that he had hired to staff this department came from. And he learned that that wasn't the flow of money at all. And so a lot of spending decisions had been made premised upon these projections. And thankfully, we had asked some serious questions of him to kind of prevent the falling off the cliff. But a lot of things that he was planning, we were saying, whoa, you can plan that based on how money moves through your firm, not necessarily how money moves through your firm now that it has this new practice area. And that is because he had his numbers dialed in and had a very firm grasp on his 3-year historical spending. Other attorneys and attorneys that he was bringing in did not. So that is a very critical mistake, a very common mistake that happens especially when smaller firms acquire other smaller firms, because not every firm is run well or run by numbers. So important to start with historicals. The other thing is to think about is you want to think about seasonality, right? So as I mentioned earlier, our client was very familiar with what the trends were, and that typically the holiday time was a time where he had money saved throughout the year and was able to distribute a good portion of that in bonuses. But then he also could very much easily rely on first quarter of the year kicking off with steam and having more than enough money to meet expenses. The problem was, in this instance, he was aware of his seasonality, right? So he knew what his practice generally brought in and when. He wasn't aware of the seasonality trend of the entire company. So he was thinking about, this is what I personally am involved with, which is what most solo owners do because that's where they start, right? But as you start to expand beyond yourself, that is something that you have to get into the habit of thinking about. The seasonality is not just practice area dependent, it is also firm wide. And you might have a surge in certain practice areas at certain times of the year. Ideally, you would be hiring or importing or acquiring practice areas that have a companion seasonality in other parts of the year. So if you are going to ultimately go out to market and look for a business to acquire or look to bring in an attorney with a book of business who does something that you don't currently do, you have to make sure that the seasonality of that practice, where at least you know where it is, right? I wouldn't tell you not to acquire a business because it has the same seasonality of revenue as your practice does. But ideally, you would be hiring a practice area. You'd be bringing in a practice area that has some ebb and flow with you, right? If you're great first quarter, maybe this practice area is great second quarter. Or if it's slow for you at the end of the year, hopefully, if it's not slow in the other practice area, you can use the revenue there to kind of smooth things out a little bit. And of course, the faster you grow and the more profitable you become, the easier it is to kind of grow through some of those cash challenges. But the last thing you want to do is require growth in order to deal with a cash crunch, right? You want to use that as a motivational opportunity for yourself, but definitely not a linchpin. Okay. All right. So second strategy that we want you to think about when you're planning your cash flow projections is you want to think about forecasting revenue by capacity, not guesswork. So one of the things that one of our senior coaches here, the longest tenured coach here at Law Firm Mentor, Wolfgang Tusoris, talks about a lot is the capacity of your firm. Like how much can your firm handle in work? Are you at a place where your firm can handle more cases, or would more cases break the bank? Would they break the machinery? Would people exceed their capacity to do more work? And of course, if you exceed your capacity, you have too much work in the firm, you are then at great risk for grievance and malpractice. So we always want to be thinking about measuring our capacity from a protective perspective. But the other thing is that you want to be thinking about the capacity in terms of knowing when to hire, making sure that you understand work allocation, right? Who gets how many cases and when, based on what stage of case they're at. And a lot of that is about timing out the legal work, which is something that most lawyers that go into business for themselves at least have some general interest in, right? Because a lot of us, we start off as lawyers and then we become business people, not vice versa, right? So I want you to think about when you're talking about measuring capacity, you want to think about how much billable capacity is available per timekeeper. And then you want to think about what that means for how much money is available to be made, right? So basic math, right? Your billable hours times the number of people putting in that number of hours at the effective rate that each of them has, times your utilization rate, right? And your utilization rate is the percentage of the work that you pass along that you expect to get back, right? So when you do that math, you're able to say, okay, if all the fates align, okay, this is not how we're going to plan our expenses, but we start here. If all the fates align, everything goes right. Every human is employed from day 1 to day 365 of the year, and they are at each of their cases billing at a certain defined rate and collecting at a certain defined rate for a certain requisite number of required hours. That is how much we expect that we can make over the course of a year. Once we have that number, that does not mean we plan based on that, right? That would be best case scenario. We don't plan for the best. We plan based on the worst, and then that best actually gives us a spread, which is our profit. But you don't want to plan for the best. You just want to know what that is. That tells you how much you could theoretically handle before you run out of space to handle your cases. The other thing is that knowing your capacity helps you with things like planning out the realities of business, right? And the realities of business include people that you're hiring and people that you're offboarding. So if you just think about historical trends, there's going to be a statistical average of the number of people that you're going to employ when the firm is at a certain size. And that is true no matter the size, whether you have 100 people on team or you have 2 people on team. You can generally look and say, overall, we expect that we are going to turn our workforce by a certain percentage every year. I'll never forget when one of my mentors, he actually is a CEO advisor for Vistage. Shout out to Mark Taffet. Mark actually came and spoke at one of our mastermind conferences. And one of the things that he does, and he does a lot of consulting with much larger companies, a lot in the finance world. And he said, this has been the trend across small and large companies, that overall you can expect 20% churn every year, right? So 1 out of 5. If you just think about from the time you started your law firm to today, are you keeping or losing? I should say, are you losing, right? Or turning 1 out of 5 people on average every year. Well, most lawyers, if I give you that stat, they'd be like, oh my God, that's awful. What kind of horrible workplace is this? But if you're in business long enough, you'll realize that there is just a very real pragmatic challenge that comes with being in business, because you're not the same every year. Your goals and desires might change every year because you're creating more, so you want more. Typically, more begets more. Oftentimes, the people that you have on team mature into phases of their career that are no longer suitable to your firm. Your firm doesn't offer what they desire anymore. And sometimes your firm grows from an evolutionary perspective, from a mindset perspective, from a process perspective that outgrows the team that you have, right? It'd be great if we could hire people and say, we're in it for the long haul together, but that's just not the reality of today's workplace. So you should expect that even if your business is perfectly well run and you are doing everything right and you treat your employees wonderfully and you compensate well, that people are going to come and go. Okay. And when you start to see those numbers and look at the actual trends in those numbers, there's a power in planning ahead for keeping your workforce staffed instead of having to react every time that somebody gives notice or every time you realize that someone needs to go. Okay. Conversion rates, big part of measuring capacity, right? At what rate are we bringing work in? And how does that affect the volume of work that can be handled? Because bringing work in as a new case has different implications than bringing cases in that are already in process. Maybe they were handled by another law firm and that didn't work out. Or maybe it was a case that suddenly surged with a lot of work. The volume of work also has to be factored into measuring the capacity of your team. Because if you were to assign 20 cases to a lawyer with nothing having been done in the cases, that is a different experience for that lawyer, for those clients, than if you were to assign 20 cases that are almost at the end, where maybe they're gearing up for trial. Or maybe there's been a lot of negotiation and now negotiation is really increasing because we're trying to settle the matter. Okay. So you need to be thinking about forecasting your revenue based on those considerations. All right. Factor number 3 in planning out your projections. Okay. So the next thing we want to talk about is the expense projections and tying them to growth levers. Okay. Now, what do I mean when I say growth lever? A growth lever is just the way in which you see the opportunity for your firm to expand. And there are a lot of things that can constitute a growth lever. So when we think about it, it could be selling more people, right? We grow just by virtue of having more clients to serve. So if every client is a $10,000 client, I have 5 clients, I have a $50,000 law firm. I have 50 clients, I have a $500,000 law firm. Did I do that math correctly? Okay, math on the fly, not my strong suit. But you get my point, right? Add a 0. So every time that we think about the volume of people that we're serving, more people means more money. Okay. Then think about how much of that money is going out. So a certain portion of your revenue is going to be allocated to expenses. And ideally, you would want to grow your ability to serve more people, your capacity, without growing the expenses associated with it. So every file has an expense, right? You might have a filing fee. You might have storage space on your cloud-based server. You might have, of course, you have people to serve, but at some point on serving a certain number of people, you might need to have some additional layers of management or administrative support to make sure that things are flowing smoothly, right? So maybe cases are initially staffed with lawyer and paralegal, but at some point you have to add a legal assistant because the volume of cases requires additional communications that you don't want done by lawyers and paralegals who could do higher value work for a fee. So you want to be thinking about those practical realities. But the other thing is that when you identify what those growth levers are we spending more? Are we bringing in more? Are we spending less? I.e. a growth lever could be managing our expenses. Perhaps the billing utilization rate is a way that we're going to make more. We're going to actually keep more of what we make because we're going to not write off expenses. We're going to be writing off fewer of those expenses. We expect to get paid a higher rate. So we're going to be more aggressive in our collection efforts. Right? All of those things are growth levers because we grow in either our profit or our revenue based on doing something in those categories of behavior. So once we know what a growth lever is, we have to think about how we can play with our expenses. And of course, you have fixed expenses, but you also have variable expenses. What can you do to reduce your expenses? Okay. Now, reducing expenses is something I am very much loath to speak about because oftentimes that is where lawyers immediately go when they say, I don't have enough money. I got to cut my expenses. There should not be a reactive desire to cut expenses. You should always be fiscally responsible with your money. So that means having a plan for how you spend money. But you should very much adopt a growth mindset that says spending money is required and is a sine qua non to making money, right? I spend money, I make money. Those two go hand in hand. And so when you think about it that way, what ends up happening is, yes, you manage your expenses, but you don't think about cutting your expenses unless the way that you are managing them is to get more for less or to be simply more of a productive user of what you have. So you don't need more. Perfect example. Practice management software. How many times do we talk to you guys about how your practice management software has 1,000 bells and whistles that you don't necessarily need right now, but that you buy? And then when you need a tech solution, you go to market. You don't even think about your practice management software, even though your practice management software will oftentimes be able to do the exact same thing that the new software that you're considering can do for you. That's a way that you could actually get more for less, right? Get more out of what you're already using. Or some of the other ways that we're thinking about tinkering with expenses. Fixed expenses are harder to tinker with, obviously, but sometimes there are opportunities there, right? You might think of your phone bill as a fixed expense. Well, maybe you negotiate yourself out of a contract that you have for your phone provider, especially if you're using a VoIP, a voice over internet phone provider, right? Or your rent. You might say, well, I'm fixed in a contract with my rent, but do you have clauses? Have you negotiated clauses? Because we talked about this and we talk about this often. In your commercial leases, are you including clauses that deal with growth, right? That if you outgrow the space, your landlord is required to release you from the contract. Or maybe even what you can do is when you have outgrown your space, approach them and say, hey, I need more space and I would love to stay here to accommodate the more space. I'm stuck in a lease with you for the next 2 years. I'm going to honor that. But if you would give me a lower price per square foot on adjacent space or space in the same building, I'd be willing to do that, right? So then you increase the total cost because you're getting more space, but you reduce the per unit cost, right? So you can play with variable and fixed expenses all the time when you actually take a qualitative look at it. The other thing is that you want to be thinking about owner draws and distributions. Like, how are you paying yourself and what opportunities might there be for you to pay yourself differently, right? One of the things that happens a lot is that when lawyers are super connected to owning the law firm. So the law firm is just an extension of you. Like, there's your wallet and then there's the law firm wallet. A lot of lawyers do that, especially when they start out. They don't put themselves on payroll. It's kind of like, I'll pay myself when I get around to it. Whole host of reasons why that's not a healthy mindset. But what we're talking about here is the timing. So if you are paying yourself, there might be reasons why you don't want to pay yourself bi-weekly on payroll with your team. You might want to do that for some portion of your income, especially if you are an S Corp, right? You do want to get to reasonable compensation for yourself, and you want to make sure that from the outside looking in, an IRS auditor would see your salary as reasonable for the size of your firm. But you also want to be thinking about how you can time out your draws and distributions in a way that doesn't adversely affect cash flow. And playing with that on a cash flow projection worksheet can actually be a very sound way of coming up to a strategy that makes more sense for you, especially if you have large outlays at definitive times of the year, such as your malpractice insurance, or perhaps you have, again, a big surge at the end of the year because you pay out bonuses at the end of the year. That might make sense for that to not be the time that you are paying yourself a bonus. Maybe you pay yourself a bonus in third quarter and your team in fourth quarter. So you want to be thinking about that as you are looking at your growth levers and the ways in which managing cash is a part of that. Because sometimes paying cash saves you not only the credit card and merchant service fee, but sometimes you'll get a discount with different vendors for paying cash. All right. Strategy number 4 that you need to consider when it's time for you to optimize your cash flow projections. And this is to integrate cash flow and timing. Okay. So what do we mean by this? This is thinking about things like mapping your receivables and your collections. And oftentimes when people are aiming to collect more, the idea is just collect more now, right? Obviously, if you got money outstanding, go get your money, right? We're never going to tell you not to go get your money. But there is a realism to the fact that if you get your money at certain times, that might be more beneficial to you, right? I already mentioned earlier that sometimes people will prepay expenses in quarter 4 so that they can reduce the tax bill for the current year. That's a very common strategy that accountants will advise you about. But you also want to be thinking about outlays of cash at other times of the year. And if you're thinking about receivables, that affects money coming in. So when do you want to have your payments come in, right? There's some level of control that you do have over that. Strategies that you can include for integrating more faster pays, payments on demand, if you will. Some of that deals with the psychology, right? We've talked about altering your collection cycle. So you're not collecting money once a month and you're not billing once a month. You're doing that more frequently. So people are paying smaller amounts more frequently. It's just easier to digest psychologically. It also helps from a cash flow household perspective, right? That your clients are paying out in spurts to you so that they don't have like a huge bill that they see at a time where they couldn't write a check for it. And they're like, oh my God, I can't afford that. And then the resistance around that saving up while you're still working on the file oftentimes leads to larger receivables. You want to think about that as well. All right. Payroll timing, tax payments, loan repayments, right? When do those things come out? When you are planning your cash flow, you want to be thinking about the timing of some of these things. And again, this is where you have some power dealing with negotiation. If you have loan payments, nothing says that they have to come out on the first of the month, right? The first of the month might be a catchy song, right? It's the first of the month. I think that was Bone Thugs and Harmony. Okay. And by the way, I know that I am dating myself by saying that. And I also appreciate you guys for sticking around while I did that torturous little song for you, because I know that singing is not my ministry. But nevertheless, you get the point, right? First of the month oftentimes becomes like the default, as does 15th of the month. Maybe that doesn't work for you. Maybe you do it around the 10th or the 20th. maybe that times out better for you based on when you tend to get money in. And a lot of times thinking about that relative to when you send bills out, the average amount of time it takes for payments to occur after you send bills out, and then the timing of when payments will go out. All of those things should be factored into your cash flow projection. And if you want to change those, absolutely tinker with those. Nothing says that you need to send people bills on the first of the month. In fact, oftentimes they're paying their mortgage or they're paying their rent on the first of the month. So maybe you want to time it out so it's a little bit before or a little after to make it a better cash flow experience for your clients that makes it easier for them to pay you. All right. The fifth and final strategy that you want to take into account in optimizing your cash flow projections is you want to build dynamic, not static projections. And this is really about revisiting. Okay. A lot of times lawyers, we're so busy. We have so many things going on that the set it and forget it becomes kind of the lay of the land. But you want to make sure that you revisit how you are managing your money and what's working and what's not working. Okay. We oftentimes talk about A/B testing, and we usually talk about it in the context of marketing. Sometimes we talk about it in the context of sales. We do talk about A/B testing your sales scripts and your intake scripts. But I want you to think about in this context, you're really looking at what is working in terms of your plan so that your planning gets better all the time. And at some point, you want to get into a process with your cash flow projections that every time you make a strategic decision, you recognize that it may have an impact on your cash flow projection. Case in point, if generally speaking, you know that you have negotiated that your loan payments are going to come out on the 10th of the month, and you know that your owner distributions are going to go out on the 5th and the 20th of the month, you have those as kind of your pillars of your cash flow projection. Well, what happens if you've decided to hire someone with a huge salary? And let's say this is a major acquisition. This person is going to bring so much opportunity into your firm, but there's a ramp up, right? Maybe this person you're not expecting to have work right away. Maybe they're leaving a firm that you know has a reputation for being very hostile and very difficult in terms of getting clients out of that firm into another firm, even though that's not ethical. We know that that happens, right? So you don't want to hire someone with a huge salary and say, oh, their salary is going to be covered by the cases they bring with them, because maybe those cases won't come. Or maybe the cases will come, but they're flat fee cases where all of the money has been earned by the previous firm. So that person is going to have work to do, but no immediate cash coming into your firm for that. You want to be thinking about that. And as you do, you want to say, okay, when we hire this person, maybe what I want to do is I want to look at how we're doing over the immediate quarter before we hire this person. And maybe I take a little bit more of a distribution before, and maybe I take a little bit more of a distribution after, but I don't take a distribution in the period of ramp up for my new hire, right? Sometimes it could be things like looking at market shifts, right? If you see overall, and some of this you can get anecdotal. I don't want to say that you can't ever rely on anecdotes, but some of this you can look at and you can see trends. But for those of you that are working with marketing companies can often be a great resource in this regard, right? What are they seeing across all of the type of businesses that are like your business, right? If you are a criminal defense firm and you generate leads online, what is your marketing company seeing in terms of other criminal defense firms that generate leads online, right? Maybe business is down overall by a certain percentage overall. Right. We've seen this a lot in the immigration space, and oftentimes immigration attorneys talking to each other, they will note that now there is more fear about even taking the first step with filing for naturalization and citizenship because of the way that our current administration is handling that issue. And so because that is something that immigration firms are having to struggle with, there oftentimes can be kind of a collective conversation that's being had, right? We certainly are seeing our immigration attorneys talking to each other about it a lot in terms of, okay, now this is generally the time of the year where we would have seen a lot of filings, and filings are down overall in this time of the year. Is that cyclical or is that a market shift, right? You need to monitor that, because if you're seeing a downward shift in your market, you want to be thinking not only how do we overcome that, like how do we improve our sales conversation? How do we shift our marketing in order to overcome some of the fear that's in the atmosphere? But you also want to be thinking about what that's going to cost and what that's going to do to your cash flow. So if you have to make more strategic investments in order to get more marketing opportunity because of what's going on in the economy or what's happening in the world in general, then that would be the time that you want to say, let's revisit that cash flow projection and make sure that our numbers still make sense for when we are distributing cash based on what we expect to come in and what we expect that might actually be a little delayed. All right, everyone. We have been talking today about your cash flow projections in your law firm. I am Allison Williams, host of the Crushing Chaos with Law Firm Mentor podcast, and I will see you on our next episode.